Well, listen, I don't know. Do you think Matthew thinks I ought to start? I suppose perhaps I ought to say something. Well, perhaps whilst he's just popped next door. I'm really sorry I can't be up with you, but it's lovely that you've come along to this session, and I'm hoping that to sort of extend and develop some thinking around this notion of a scripture-led curriculum. And I'm conscious that obviously we're all waiting with bated breath for the new curriculum directory to be produced. But irrespective of the arrival of that, I think there's been a movement to really think deeply about how we use scripture in our curriculum for some time now. And so irrespective of the form that our new curriculum might have to take in response to obviously frameworks that we might be working in, I think it's an enduring responsibility. I should say, for those who don't know me, I'm a professor at Canterbury Christ Church University, which I've worked for many, many years. I think one or two of you I've met before. And Matthew, you're back. Did you want to say something before I start? I was about to leap in there. So
thank you. Do we want the volume down a bit, or is that okay? Fine. Thank you, Bob. So on behalf of ATCRE, we're really pleased to have you at our conference. You're really welcome. And you've started to introduce yourself. Bob has a really fantastic reputation in the country, and some of you will have used his textbooks at A-level, perhaps. Anyone? Hands up. Oh, let me just show you the hands.
I'll see who's not got their hand up then. Oh, there we are. Very good. Excellent. Lovely.
So you've got your fan bases here.
Oh, terrific.
Did anyone bring their textbooks for signing?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. Another
I really am very sorry I can't be with you. I have to say I've missed enormously these sorts of times, but for logistical reasons it's not possible today. But yeah. Okay, so I often begin with when I think about talking about scripture with Nehemiah chapter 8, and this is Ezra, who I'm sort of constantly fascinated by Ezra, and Ezra has come back from Babylon, and he's done this thing of he's become a kind of personification of Moses. He's led his people back from the Babylonians to Jerusalem, but it's kind of been a bit of a disappointment, because the arrival at Jerusalem, they must have built up this return as a really great opportunity to see what life for the people of God was like, but actually things were a little bit sort of scratchy back in Jerusalem, and so he realizes he's got a kind of new mission. He's not just lead the people back, but it's actually leading people back into a better relationship with God. And there's a nice text in chapter 8, which I always find in chapter 8 of Nehemiah, which I always find is filled with sort of insight for me as a teacher, and for what might some of the things that I might think about with scripture. And this is when the people are gathered together in the square before the Watergate, and Ezra brings forward the book of Moses and the law before the assembly. It says both men and women and all who could hear with understanding. There's an interesting thing going on in this text about understanding, and Ezra being stood over them higher, because they built the wooden platform for him to stand up on. It's one of the reasons scripture is read from a higher point in our liturgy. So but you need to be prepared for understanding. You need to be prepared to stand under the text, and be prepared to, if you like, submit to it, give allow it to invade you, perhaps. Anyway, he read it facing the square before the Watergate from early morning until midday. So we're going to be a bit briefer than that today. But he also describes the text describes a big group of people who are there to assist with the people for understanding. So it's not just one voice, it's not just Ezra. The long list of names I can't pronounce, including the Levites, are all going to be there to help people understand the law while the people were in their places. And it says, so they read from the book, from the law of God, with interpretation. They gave the sense so that the people understood the meaning. So the notion of the senses of meaning and the idea that interpretation is a pedagogic activity is there in Nehemiah, and I think about that because I remember 20 years ago when I was teaching Mark's Gospel GCSE, which I loved, and I loved the fact that the year of my life was sort of framed by wherever I was in Mark's Gospel, because your sort of the scheme of work wasn't just, it was like your whole life. There was always, oh, we're at that bit now, that must mean it's it's coming on to Easter or coming on to April or whatever. but I didn't spend any time with the students talking about interpretation. I mean, of course, every lesson involved interpretation because we always were talking about the text. But I'm quite ashamed to say, it never dawned on me that I would spend some time thinking about, what's going on when we're interpreting? How we, what sort of things should we be thinking about? What traditions of interpretation are there? What are their relative strengths and weaknesses? What guidance and advice is there on this from the church? So in a sense, I now think about that a lot, and that's what I'm going to try and say a few things about. I'm going to share a bit of a PowerPoint, but let's see how this works. I don't know, sometimes it doesn't translate, but I've got the green light around a document that says a scripture-led curriculum. And I'm hoping you can see that. Great, thumbs up from the front from someone who looks vaguely familiar. Thank you. It's good to see you again too. So that's me, and that's my email address. And that tinyurl.com ATCRE Bible link will take you to a version of the text that I prepared to help me remember what to say, as well as the PDF of the PowerPoint, so you can download that. Just to say that there's a load of free stuff which relates to this on that nicer.org.uk. Nicer is the Christian Education Research Centre that I lead. I have a team of, maybe a dozen colleagues at Canterbury who are working on nicer projects across a wide range of things. Texts and Teachers is one of the projects that's closely related to what I'm talking about today, and there are guides in there about that work and about that project and the findings, but also some of the things I'm going to refer to. But do have a good look around that website in terms of resources. The Faith and the Nexus project was all about faith, the family, and the church, and there's a wealth of material there now designed for helping to talk about faith for children. That's more primary, but I think it also applies to Key Stage 3 as well. We've got our project on science, religion encounters, and the chaplaincy project, which is about how chaplains are working in secondary schools to support, particularly support children in transition in year 7 and year 8 as a response to the current situation. So do have a good look on that website, because there are maybe more of our projects would be interesting to you, and you can subscribe to all sorts of things. That's the advert. I should always identify the two colleagues who work very closely with me on the Texts and Teachers project. Now Professor Farid Panjwani, who's now at Aga Khan University in Pakistan, and also Katie Clemmy, who leads our PGCERE. And so I'm not going to talk about that project in particular right now, but I would recommend it to you. And it has been really instrumental in some of our thinking of how teachers engage with this question of a scripture-led curriculum. So to say a few things at the outset, when we're talking about the scholarship of sacred texts, we use a phrase, sacred text scholarship, to try and sort of perhaps pluralize a little bit our notions here. We're interested in the locus of meaning. Where does meaning rest? I've got a great book by Van Hooser, who's one of the seminal Protestant scripture scholars, who titled his book, "Is There a Meaning in This Text?" And it's a really provocative question when you start to ask the question, where does meaning reside? Is it something that you sort of, is it like a proposition that you dig out of the text? You sort of have to shovel in and then you find it, and then you don't sort of need the other stuff that was around it before. You've got the thing now, and you can then take it away. But does it have to touch you now? In other words, is it something that's about the reader too? And so what are we to make of context then, and significance in people's lives, and how do we work out the balance of those things? So that's the territory we're interested in, and you can immediately start to see why this is so pertinent for our religious education, because of course we start off and you see this writ across all of the kind of teaching advice that the church gives on exploring scripture and that the scholars give. We are not simply doing a job of archaeology. It is not just history, and therefore, if it is not just history, then what is it more than that? What is it that's more than that? So hermeneutics is concerned with both knowing and knower. I sometimes teach epistemology to one of our program, several of our programs at Canterbury, and I do a little exercise with a coin in a box, and I put the coin in the box and close the box and shake it up, and now the coin is either heads up or tails up, and then you ask the class. Okay, I mean, of course, it could have stood on its side, but that's unlikely, right? So it's probably head up or tails up. So you say who thinks it's heads and who thinks it's tails, and at that point, there is a fact, and the fact is that it's either heads or tails. So half of the group, let's say, who put their hands up for the correct side, but they don't know yet. We don't know. The fact has not become known. Knowledge requires that we open the box and look in. And the thing that turns the fact into knowledge is the presence of the knower, the person, the knowing person. So at a really sort of basic level of knowledge and our theory of knowledge, we realize that it is not just the coin in the box, it is also that it is known that it is heads up or tails up, which I think speaks in a really interesting way to a concept of revelation, which is not just something of the past, but of something of the now that reaches up and touches us. So hermeneutics is concerned with knowing and knower. And when I say scripture first or scripture led, this is quite a challenging idea, because it actually is an interruption of some of the ways in which we handle text quite normally and also quite legitimately. But it's nevertheless a challenge to it, because what it really means is when you encounter text, you're often doing it for some other purpose. So you might be wanting to explain, for example, the relationship between certain texts and an understanding of one of the sacraments, or you will be trying to use certain texts to explore a concept. So, and of course, many different texts might reflect on the concept of word or concept of sort of incarnation, or so you have another objective in mind, and the other objective might be an aspect of doctrine, or it might be an aspect of ritual, and even if you are engaging, and this is true perhaps in many other religious education circumstances, where we're engaging the text really from perhaps a social or political context. We're looking at the topic of women or sexuality in the church or in religion, or we're looking at a topic of violence or war or conflict or justice. And then again, you then are pointed to certain texts which are sort of in the service of those concepts. Scripture first is saying, put those categories to one side now. Put those frames to one side. Your principle is engaging with the text. Your educational project is engaging with the text, engaging with scripture. And that is what's leading your learning objectives. And that for this time, I'm not saying all RE should be this, but for some time, that is what should be driving us. We are no longer worried about how it is going to leap out into all those different areas. That will be interesting. We'll come to that, but we're principally interested in an encounter or an engagement with the text, with a view that perhaps, this is a line that Trevor Cooling has spoken quite a bit about, the idea that RE has an aim to educate students to become responsible interpreters of religion, and I would say, and responsible interpreters of text, and maybe understanders of the way texts are interpreted. So on the project I referred to, we found that teachers could develop techniques around this kind of idea, or this kind of aim for education. One of the participants talked about a kind of meta conception of what they were doing in RE. It's interesting. They found what Anthony Thistleton writes about when he writes about his experience of teaching scripture. He's another Protestant scripture scholar, but who has written really importantly influenced scripture scholarship in the 20th century. And he talks about how the students changed their approach to scripture as a result of their experience of learning, and they would talk about this, and he outlines this in his books, and which is what we found when we worked with teachers on this project. So we were asked, where can we find an opportunity to study a longer piece of text for the text itself? So where is our chance of doing that in our curriculum? Where can we nudge aside the other pressures of the other interest in, where can we say we will study this text now in and for itself. There are three organizing principles to that: the text itself, then the text in the life of the faithful community, and that happens over time. That's, Ezra is part of that story. That Ezra 8 is a part of the story, but part of the story is what happens on Sunday morning in liturgy and worship today. And then the study of the text as it is reread by new readers, including the pupil. Rereadership is part of our concept of what we're trying to conjure or develop for children in our classroom. So this is a decisive move in our hermeneutics. We're moving away from a notion of a fixed total concept of the text where everything is certain and known about all of its meaning, to one that is more dynamic, because we want our pupils to be beginning a journey that we might hope is a lifelong journey of being able to constantly make connection between their life experiences and scripture. So that is not simply memorization of facts or list of proposition of what it means. It has to be something more than that. That's not a propositional concept. Doesn't have the concept of revelation now in my life as a sort of a fact that I'm putting in my head. That is where we're going. So yes, hermeneutics is about knowing, and that's knowing entails making sense of the world around us, how we read the world over time with experience, and how we, in our situated context, reread things. I'm always a little bit nervous in our sort of, again, this is a little bit of epistemology here for this Saturday afternoon, about the question of subject and object. We like to sort of decide where do we stand? Are we relativists or are we absolutists? We love binaries. We love this binary thing. Really, there's an awful lot of thinking that is challenging that binary notion, whether that's within movements towards critical realism or sort of subjectivist objectivism. There's a real challenge to that binary because of the notion of encounter, and I think it's quite an incarnational challenge. Actually, the encounter of the person is so central in Catholic thinking that, and I think in Western philosophical thinking, that it is very dangerous to over-conceptualize and over-propositionalize how we're presenting meaning, because meaning is an encounter with a person, the student, the rereader. So we should educate students not only in the stuff that disciplines engage, but also the practice. That's a bit controversial in hermeneutics because Gadamer was rather suspicious. If any of you are interested in that, Gadamer was rather suspicious of disciplinary reading, and there's an unresolved debate there, but let's just sketch over that one for the time being. A way of knowing, a way of reading, a way of interpreting. One of my colleagues, Simon Wilson, who's really interested in scripture, is always talking about how we create dispositions to attend to a text. One of the great hermeneutical thinkers, Ricoeur, used to talk a lot about this. What else do we bring when we bring to reading the text? What are we overlaying it with? What maybe conscious or even subconscious interests are operating when we try to bring a meaning, or we try to sort of find something in there. It's a constant challenge to be alert to that which we bring. This classically happens when we think we already know what the story is about, and we think we know that the story means this one thing, and so therefore in some sense we've switched off to what the text might be saying because we've already superimposed what we brought to it. And as educators, there's a dilemma there, because when you start out, you want to have simple meanings, but you don't want to leave children with the idea that there are only simple meanings, because you want them to see that they can proceed on a journey, that there are layers. I often think a better way of thinking about text is, I was actually back in Pembrokeshire in this summer, and Pembrokeshire Coastal Path, the cliffs there, they're fantastic. And at the very one of the beautiful things about the very tallest of the cliffs is you start to see the different strata rock formation, of rock type, and the different materials. You see them like stripes across these cliffs because there's something kind of really there's something about that. And I often think that when we start with text, we're walking along the top of the path on the grassy bit, but there are layers and layers and layers and layers, like our human consciousnesses. Let's say there are layers of meaning that are operating, and if we and we can kind of dig into those layers and begin to see much more. And they're operating together. It's not that one is false and one is true. It's that there are several. Anyway, there we are. So scholarly practices that we want to uncover to help. Now, there is a big debate within hermeneutics that has washed all the way through and in different ways of thinking about scripture and interrupt us all the time in terms of what we might be doing in classrooms, where the question, where does meaning happen, and whether meaning happens in the mind of the author or in the mind of the reader. And let's cut to the chase here, which is, this is one of these binaries that we've got to be suspicious of. Okay, so we can think, of course, it's the author. What did the author mean? What did the gospel writer mean when they wrote this? And there's a very important part of scripture scholarship which has taken place to try and understand the context in which that writing was written, the literary form of that text, so that we're importantly understanding what those first hearers will have heard, or those first readers saw. This is a really important project. But we must be suspicious of the idea that we expect the mind of the reader to have had a total knowledge of that which they wrote. And I think this is important in at least two ways. There are two really big problems with this. Which of us can say in all honesty, we can know for certain all that is meant by the things that we write? I just think that is such a claim. In an age where we're so aware of things like unconscious bias, when we're aware of the fact that words carry things that are not just our intention. Language is a shared project. I can't choose the meaning of every word. There's a great Lewis Carroll moment where Humpty Dumpty says the text means exactly what I say it means and nothing else, and I'm in charge. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, language is a shared project. This comes up in translation when you have to make decisions between which word you use to translate one for another, because in any language system, the bundle of things that a word might mean do not mirror each other over the equivalent words. And you have to make a judgment. A translator, the art of translation is about making the judgment. And if you translate more narrowly and exclude some of those meanings from the first language, then are you sure what have you done there? And there's some distortion. We can't imagine that the mind of the author is the mind of God, at least not the mind of the human author, I should say. God can operate in language too, and messages can come through language that come from many other sources, and are not simply the author's intention. So we don't. Yes, the author is important. Yes, the time is important. Understanding what a psalm was. What a psalm was, and why it's different from what a law was, and why that might be different from what an epistle of Paul is or was. Yes, you need to know those things, but don't think that's total. That's not the totalizing thing. These are the two dangers. On the one hand, there is the sort of totalizing fundamentalism, where there is no place for the interpreter at all. I mean, it is always a lie to say that there is no interpretation, I think, because I cannot see how language can operate with a human mind if there is no interpretation. So I think it is a deceit, but there's certainly a claim of the totalizing fundamentalist to say that there is no place for the subject. The reader has no place. There is no place for ongoing revelation. Revelation was a thing that happened and is fixed. It's happened in the past. This conflicts with the notion that incarnation is revelation, because Christ is not fixed. Christ is dynamic. The totalizing fundamentalism simply says that meaning is propositional. In other words, it is a kind of like it's maybe one way of thinking about this. It's the kind of approach to textual interpretation that was that was perhaps unduly inspired by the 17th and 18th centuries desire for proof, the kind of scientific proof of fact. So we've got the facts now. That's what it is. We don't need to, so it's a kind of it's a sort of almost like an addiction to that sort of natural science desire for the fact, the proof, the quantitative measure, the definitive. Authority is the locus of meaning, and there can be no universal meaning. This is my suggestion, although I think, to be fair, totalizing fundamentalists claim it is universal. But for a meaning to be universal, and this is something that Pope Benedict wrote about a lot in his writings on this, it can't stay in history. It transcends history. Sort of notions like Christ rises from the dead. There's a historical resurrection, but Christ is risen matters too. The Christ is risen, the risen Lord matters too. If there was no Christ is risen, then the Christ rose from the dead of the past. It kind of almost becomes like a magic show. Well, yeah, there once something extraordinary happened on a medical scene, but actually extraordinary things happen medically. But that Christ is risen is a present tense matter. And so a sort of totalizing fundamentalism that puts literalism in a historical meaning loses its power to be present because it has to reside in the past. The other danger is the relativist postmodern danger, which again, there is no transcendence because all meaning is within the subject. All meaning is within the subject. It's all within your own interpretation. There is no connection to anything greater or beyond. So the individual is the locus of meaning, and context is king. There is nothing other than context. And what that means ultimately is we can't have revelation, because revelation is something from out with to. So we lose the idea that God can intervene in history. We lose the idea that God can reveal to history, that there can be a relational dimension. And I think both of these errors miss the relationship. That they miss the notion of, let's say, we could say, the insight of a Trinitarian God, where there is a relationality taking place into which we are invited. So I think that's why these are two clear errors. But it's very easy to fall into the language of these errors. It's very easy to give attention to one or the other. And you can be tempted by both. You want your students to make connections with their lives, so you can, if you're not careful, go exclusively into a relativist postmodern sense, because you want them to see that connection. And also, you might feel very strongly compelled, but I want there to be certainty around meaning. You might desire that certainty, even if there's a nice phrase that's used by, I'm just looking for his book, Stephen Fowle, in Engaging Scripture. He talks about the idea that Scripture is underdetermined. We've not yet finished. We've not yet discovered everything that can be discovered in Scripture. It's not that we don't know what Scripture means, but we don't know everything that Scripture means. And so there is a mission, there is a project of ongoing. So we miss the relationality if we commit either one of these errors, but they're very tempting, as I say. Maybe somewhere between the mind of the reader, the mind of the author, with the activity we would say from let's say an Orthodox Catholic understanding, with the activity of things beyond even the author and even the reader, the universal, the transcendent God. And that is a puzzle. But I've raised it as a question because it's a fascinating question to ask people what they think by something. I remember there's an image that's used sometimes when Trevor Cooling's talking about hermeneutics and worldviews, and it's you have two people in a cartoon and they're arguing over the meaning of a number that's on the ground between them. They're standing either side of the number, and one says it's number 6 and the other says it's a number 9. And there was a really interesting debate about this on one of the social media groups in Facebook for RE teachers, and someone posited, well, there was a true answer, and that was that which was intended by the person who wrote the number, and that's the Humpty Dumpty answer. That is it means what I mean it to mean. But remember, you may have intended something by your speech, but your speech might carry more meanings than you ever realized. psychologists can tell us about this, but I think also that's true if we take seriously the idea that our scripture is both human and divine, and that the words, that there is a greater mind behind the words of scripture than simply one human author. Okay, so I've labored that point a lot, but there we are. So okay, so one of the questions is, all right, this is there's a world of language here. There's a way of talking about meaning. There's a way of talking about this kind of hermeneutic stuff. I always recommend, I haven't grabbed both of them, but there are a couple of very nice, easy, if you're feeling a little bit lost with this stuff, then a very short intro. I love the very short introduction series in general, but Jen Zimmerman has written a really nice one on hermeneutics. David Jaspers gives you a short, these are short readables. But the other book, which I now recommend as standard, I don't know if you can see me as well, but there's the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, and the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible is one of those books I'd really strongly recommend you have in the library or in your office, because it gives you a few pages at the very beginning on Catholic thinking, scholarship, and authoritative summaries of the principles of interpretation. So it's a really good sort of textbook for thinking about interpretation, as are the Charpentier books, How to Read the New Testament, How to Read the Old Testament, still available secondhand for just a few quid on Amazon, which are good, although they tend to prioritize the historical critical method, but perhaps I'll come back to that. I've also included a couple of links there to a key document, which is the Teaching on Interpreting Scripture, and that is a sort of post-Second Vatican Council document. It was still quite controversial, but it summarizes a range of methods that can be used to make sense of Scripture, all of which have their limitations. And that's a very interesting point, that there is an understanding of the intellectual limitation of any approach to interpretation. And that is, if you could say, it's quite a modern, almost a scientific approach to interpretation. Anyway, there's a couple of links which I've included there. So some texty questions. What does the text mean? If we ask what does the text mean, we might imply there's a single answer. What's one thing? What meanings does this text bear? So that implies a possible multidimensionality. There might be several meanings. Some of them might be better contenders than others. Some of them might speak to some environments more fully than others. So that difference need not be a weakness or a limitation. That difference could be the power of Scripture to speak across many contexts. Is there a meaning in this text? Is it in the text? Is it in my head? Is it in the author's head? Is it in between? We've said a little bit about that. One of the interesting things about meaning is that meaning can be lost and then rediscovered. Think of the significance of the Rosetta Stone, that great stone in the British Library, which unlocked meanings that were lost to the present. So in past meanings, it was important because it had multiple languages, ancient languages, and so it could be used as a key for unlocking ancient Near Eastern, Middle Eastern languages. And so lost meanings became known again. Knowledge returned, present living, despite there being no mind that carried it in between the centuries and the millennia. So meaning is quite a mysterious thing. Revelation is part of the revelation and meaning, of course, are sort of interconnected deeply. And there is this notion in the Catholic tradition of the multiple layers, sometimes called the multiple senses of meaning. And this is very important in our approach to Scripture, because we need to be really conscious of the kind of literary form. So we need to know a little bit about the literary form. If we're going to study a text, for itself, we need to understand what we can make from the form that text takes, as well as the historical background to it, what place it might have had in the life of the community. So, and remember, with history, it's not just the history that the text purports to tell, but also the history that we can deduce of the text in the life of the community of the faithful. So the narrative of Moses, there's an open question about whether Moses was a historical personality. For sure, there's a lot of archaeology we don't have, right, about Moses, is for sure, and there's a lot of people who, it's pretty clear that Ezra was a historical person and that Moses had a real impact on the community of Israelites when they were exiled in Babylon. So there is always a historicity around those texts, but it's not just, or not exclusively, or not necessarily the historical nature of the events as described. There is always a commingling. The best picture I've got, this is one I borrow from Margaret Carswell. Dr. Margaret Carswell is a good friend and a leading scripture sacred text education in the world, really. And if you've not seen this before, the three, so this is how Margaret teaches historical critical methods or hermeneutics to 6-year-olds. And you'll see that on the green circle, there are a sort of figures that look a bit biblical. We could have a story going on, the sort of something to do with a storm perhaps, and it looks vaguely Palestinian and sort of from the time. So that's that world, the world of the text that the text is purporting to tell the story about. You've then got a grey circle where there are figures talking. This is the world of the early church, so the people who were hearing the story in the green. So that is the story, the bubble of the green, shall we say, was being talked about by a community of faith. And they are standing on the green circle. And then there's also the purple circle at the top. And this is the church, or maybe this is our classroom. Maybe this is our classroom today, or our Sunday morning gathering, or our Vatican Council, or whatever, but it's our present. Now, you can see that there are some keys that are sort of dribbled across all three of those circles, kind of connecting little key. I'm talking about the little keys that are on the ground. So there is a thread between those three worlds, and you can see the scripture, the Bible, is a sort of a bridge between the grey circle, the early church, the formation of the canon of scripture, and the present that we understand. But one of the things that's really powerful about that is when we look back at the text of the story world, we look through the grey. We always look, we can't look except but look through the hearing of the text by the early church. That's because scripture came after the community of faith. So the community of faith formed, and then its scripture came. So it was that's about the redaction, the gathering of the texts, the discerning of which texts would be canonical, and then the conversation around the texts. So that it's never direct. And maybe there might be a Protestant Catholic kind of debate there that would be an interesting one to sort of explore. Although many scripture scholars are in a lot more agreement than perhaps some of the leaders of the churches are actually. But that's another matter for another talk perhaps. So when we read those stories, and we are reading the story world through the world of the early church community, and of course we are bringing our world to that, because in the purple world, language and the words and the significance of words that we're using are coming from our context. So I load things. I remember once I used to, before COVID, I would go regularly to Teze all my life, bringing children or school groups, any excuse. As you get older, you have to come up with new excuses to keep going back to the Teze community. But the family program, which is fantastic. If any of you've got small children, I strongly recommend. We went 5 or 6 times. It's a terrific week. It's sort of crazy, but terrific. And but one of the things about that is you've gathered together in quite a big tent with a lot of different languages going on, and then a brother comes and you get a Bible study. And then so what happens is you have to sort yourself out into your translation group. So there'll be Italians over on one side and the Romanians over here, and anyway he says something and then it gets translated because the parents don't all speak English, right? So we've got to sort of work that out. And what happens because it's quite discursive, so there's a talk, but then there are questions. And you realize after a bit, what happens is people start debating local translation because yes, everybody might have a blue sort of New Jerusalem Bible, but it's in their own local languages, and then you start realizing, oh, hang on a minute, what do you mean by that? Do you mean this or that? Or, you know, and you realize when it comes down to notions of meaning and words, you know, so sort of, you know, in some languages forgiveness has a little bit of judgment in it, but not in other languages. And so when you're trying to translate, you get these wonderful interesting nuances. And of course, we know when it comes to the development of doctrine and teaching, you know, things like, do you translate the Mary as a virgin, or do you translate the Mary as young woman? And there is kind of loaded significance on those little directions, depending on whether you take a more Protestant or more Catholic perspective of Mary's perpetual virginity, and all these sorts of things become really quite interesting in those moments. So anyway, I wanted to bring up the senses of meaning. This is the thing that I wished I had taught always. I almost would like this to be taught at primary schools, for sure. That the quadriga isn't like, it's not like sort of totally dogmatic that there are these four senses and that's all, but it's a practice that began in the early church, in the early centuries of the Christian church. It remained popular in the medieval times, although it was rejected by some of the reformers but not entirely within Protestantism. And it remains something that is an advisory method to understand the different kinds of senses that we operate with when we're looking at scripture, these different layers, these different sort of geological layers maybe that are operating with the text. Yes, there is a literal sense, and here we're not talking about fundamentalist literalism. So it's used in a different technical sense. When you see the word literal, there's a sort of undue literalism. You might see that sometimes in Catholic language, but then there's the typological, then there is the tropological and the anagogical. So these layers of meaning are the things that I think what we'll be wanting to do is encourage our students to step into. Now, I noticed that Matthew has turned the camera around, and I also see that we're rapidly approaching the end of our time. So let me just kind of move to a bit of a wrap up. When you're looking at your curriculum, obviously you're going to have all sorts of pressures on what you're going to do. Maybe you've got a recommendation locally to follow a certain set of texts. Maybe you're being driven by, of course, GCSE if you're secondary, who isn't. But find the space where you can explore text for itself. You won't be able to do it every year, maybe, but there might be some space. I know some have experimented with really, really diving in, where you're a little freer from objectives that come in the service of, doctrine, or in the service of themes for topics on GCSE, and space to explore meanings and meaningfulness and senses of meaning with your classes. The evidence that we had from our participants on the project was that actually this came very naturally to children when it was introduced, and they could then use it, and teachers could then use these different notions of meanings quite happily when talking about text. So it enabled them to talk differently about the meaning of text. And that was something that was common across all the settings that we were working with on that project. So if we can do that, then perhaps we can come up with something different with our engagement with text. So much for question time, eh? There's always a danger of that. But listen, I don't know if you've got to kind of move on, or if someone would like to ask a question right now, probably there's no time. But I'm very happy to answer questions, or I'm very happy to address questions, respond to them by email if people are interested. And if anybody would like to have a conversation, then also I'm always happy to talk text.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Oh, yes, of course. Let's see if I can
see you more clearly.
Let's see if I can manage to do that. There we go.
And I just invite people to respond in the...
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Oh, it's lovely to see you all. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I probably would have monitored time a little bit more judiciously, but listen, good luck. And you know, I am constantly in I just want to say I think you do a great job and a really important job. And I know that from my own time as a head of RE, there are moments of kind of insanity. Why do you do this sort of thing? But I meet people all the time. I meet students at universities who have been touched by their religious education and their religious educators. So I just wanted to sort of really affirm your work, and you know, in those dark moments where you think, why do I do this stuff? Remember that the ripples that it has, the ripples that Ezra and his collaborators and cooperators bring are positively felt. So I wish you all well with the ongoing term and for the rest of the conference, and thank you for the opportunity to have a few moments with you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Can I